Final Fantasy 16 sales are catastrophic, Josh Brown, at least over on the Xbox platform. This comes from Alinea Analytics, reporting the game has only sold around 22,000 copies on Xbox in its first week versus the 3 million on PlayStation 5 back in June 2023. This comes after the game was shadow dropped during the June Xbox showcase, with, I would say, very little marketing alongside. I kind of forgot that it was even available. I'm someone who adores Final Fantasy 16 and has played through it multiple times, but I feel like the way Square Enix handled this thing on Xbox was like, it's kind of there if you want it. We're not really going to push it much outside of the showcase. I also feel like a lot of the attention was given to Final Fantasy VII Remake finally arriving on Xbox. That's something people have been waiting for like half a decade on the Xbox side. And Square Enix ended the trailer for FF7 Remake saying it'll be arriving this winter, but 16 was available straight away. Also, Final Fantasy 16 saw around 27,000 concurrent players on Steam. That was when it arrived on Steam in September last year. And on the Xbox side was down in the 400s of the most played chart as written up by Push Square. There's a little bit more to this because the actual version of Final Fantasy 16 on Xbox seems to also be a bit of a fire. But thoughts on this? I want to talk about Squeenix, I want to talk about Final Fantasy, I want to talk about what the living hell's going on, Josh Brown.
Yeah, it's not great, is it?
No.
I think it's especially not great because literally a year ago, maybe slightly less than a year ago, Square Enix, in response to a lot of games like Final Fantasy 16 and Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth underperforming, they said, we are not doing these exclusive deals anymore, we are not going to go into business with Sony and have it be like this nice sharing of resources because we are not selling enough on PlayStation and Steam. So their gambit is to open it up to the likes of Switch, to the likes of Xbox. And I know there are a lot of factors that go into this launch specifically, but these are not promising that that is going to be a long-term viable plan. Just the idea that they can put it on more platforms and then somehow transform these games into overnight smash success stories. That has not translated here, and I worry that it won't translate when Final Fantasy VII comes at the end of the year, because that, even more so than Final Fantasy 16, yes, it might have that broader appeal for people who love the franchise and have fond memories of the older game, but that, like you said, has been out shockingly half a decade at this point.
I feel like the overall push, the whole wider thing about the action focus and the way the recent Final Fantasies have gone, with both of the remake project titles being, a lot more action heavy, Final Fantasy 16 being a lot more of a platinum style hack and slash action game or whatever. The way that I feel like that's been received over time, they have their fans. I love 16. I liked FF7 Remake and then kind of hated Rebirth. JB's a way bigger fan of Rebirth than me, but I feel like that's part of the conversation on either it's because they took a little bit too long and those questions kind of, maybe saturate a little bit in terms of people going, I'm just not going to bother with this game. There's also that wider conversation on Xbox fans or Xbox owners just don't buy games. Just wait for Game Pass, just give it a minute. It'll probably be on Game Pass. A lot of people buying Xboxes for Game Pass, and then when something arrives that has a premium price point only, the conversation being that maybe they are, not as bothered about it. If you wait long enough, would it just come to Game Pass? Final Fantasy 16, though, like I said, on Xbox, its performance is apparently very unstable, with the game running at a locked 60 FPS, but only hitting 720p. So I guess that side of it is stable enough.
Yeah,
but if you go into the quality mode, it's a little bit more shaky. That's where it lines up a little bit more with the original PlayStation 5 version, which can hit 1080p in performance mode, but that game has a very shaky frame rate. 720p, Josh Brown.
I cannot believe Jeremy.
What are we doing?
Only 720p's in this house. Honestly, like you, I have really enjoyed all of the modern Final Fantasy games. I really, really liked Rebirth. I'm sorry to say, I thought it was great. But all of those games, what they have in common are usually quite bad performance modes. Whether you're playing 16 on the PlayStation 5 in performance modes, you're having to make, in my opinion, pretty substantial compromises, whether that's to the frame rate itself not being completely stable, or it's more likely to the overall resolution and muddiness of the picture. And even after a few patches, if I recall, on PlayStation 5, they could never get it quite right for most of those games. It took the PlayStation 5 Pro releasing until you got Final Fantasy VII Rebirth being able to be played in performance mode at a high resolution and stable. So it's not a surprise that it's a similar situation when it comes to the Xbox Series X version, But it's not going to convince people to go out and buy it, is it? It's not like it's coming after so many years of refinements and is acting as the definitive edition. Arguably, in many cases, from the write-ups that I've seen, it's coming in under the PlayStation 5 version in terms of optimization here and there, which is just, it's not what you want. And again, it doesn't incentivize people to go out and buy this 2-year-old game when there's so many other titles on the market, including, of course, the Final Fantasy killer, Claire Obscure 33.
They give the Final Fantasy slaughterer.
That's
holding it up and
yes.
shooting it. Absolutely running a chainsaw through it, you might say. It's worth noting that on the Square Enix side, even back when 16 sold 3 million copies on PS5, they still viewed that as underperforming. So who even knows what conversations are happening where it's bringing in 22,000 units? You can argue, obviously, the 2-year gap, the initial hype window leading up to 16 versus it coming in now a couple of years later. But you still have a whole platform's worth of players who, in theory, are waiting to play this anticipated game or whatever it is, and that is an insane drop. That's like 1,000% less or something.
Scott, when you do this job, or when you just are interested in an industry like this for a long enough time period, you see the mistakes repeat themselves. I remember when Square Enix had this very same confrontation with reality a decade ago, when even though it sold incredibly well overall, something like Final Fantasy 15 isn't picked up by Xbox players for whatever reason. Right. And you might assume that, yes, a long time has passed. We've got whole brand new audiences. We've got a brand new approach for Xbox in general. But they have pivoted from exclusivity to multi-platform multiple times at this point, and I think it's time for them to just realize it might just be the games, because even though I enjoy them, you need Final Fantasy, in my opinion, to feel cutting edge, and at this current time, I feel like Final Fantasy is quite ignorable in the grand scheme of things. Outside of course, its dedicated fan base, but when it comes to that kind of broader penetration, I don't know, everyone's talking about Claire Obscure to the point where it completely breaks out of its niche, completely becomes this almost worldwide phenomenon, right? Thanks to word of mouth. You don't get that with Final Fantasy 16, even though I do think it's a good game and worth playing. You get a lot of Final Fantasy fans arguing over whether it's even a Final Fantasy game to begin with, right? And you need that kind of word of mouth for a game to succeed in the modern day, I think.
To be fair, I think you're right, and I think that Square Enix or Final Fantasy as a brand maybe burned its last mainstream card with 15. I feel like there was a lot of hype running into 15 after the previous games. 14 was rebooted. Obviously, it's still an MMO. That game is flying to new heights now, but its initial launch was really bad. 13, I would say one of the worst ones in the series. Its reputation is whatever. It's a whole thing. People like 13. Some people like 13. I'm not one of them. My overall point was that I don't feel like Final Fantasy has grabbed the industry and shook it since 10, really. And then 15 felt like they're getting it all back together. It's going to be a really good restorative Final Fantasy. And then that game was just broken. And it had so many different fixes after launch. They had to replace one of the chapters entirely. There was a whole thing with the back half of that game being nowhere near as polished as it should have been. And it was in development hell for a very long time. Started as a spin-off from 13, became 15. It was a whole thing. But yeah, where we are now, and because we're in the shadow of Claire Obscure, it's hard not to look at these numbers and look at Final Fantasy as a brand and think about that thing that you just said, where, when was the last time everyone was thinking about this stuff? Even if you're not a fan, you knew it was omnipresent. And so I did want to mention that on the marketing stuff that I mentioned at the start, trying to think of the ways that Square Enix have pushed Final Fantasy 16 as the next main installment, because 15 had the Pocket Edition, had the wider chapters that were added, that were character-focused stories. 16 hasn't had a whole lot to it. There's been Clive turned up in Tekken 8 as a way of doing some sort of crossover thing with Namco, and I wrote down the Kenny Omega's entrance in AEW was a bit Final Fantasy 16 themed, because it was the whole graphical package was themed around 16, and they got the composer and everything to do that. But that's about it, Josh Brown.
Yeah, it is. I mean, even before the game came out, it already felt like Square Enix, in my opinion, had mentally moved on to Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth. They were both weirdly kind of announced at the same time, and then although 16 took focus, we were immediately into hyping up Rebirth. We got the DLC for 16 as well, which again, similarly kind of came and went. Then this was shadow dropped, whereas Intergrade, an older game, is getting more of a build-up. It's getting more hype. It's coming this winter. We're going to probably have a bigger lead-in compared to this kind of, it's there if you want it. Like, you need to have confidence in your product because there is so much that you can show off from Final Fantasy 16 that looks spectacular that I think might convince someone to give it a shot. But they don't even seem to care.
The weird thing as well is that, like I said, I love 16. I adored my time with it and love the characters, love the overall world, and especially the music. The DLC did feel like things that were sliced off the main game. Like the first DLC is ostensibly one big combat tower, and the second one is more story focused, and it involves like dealing with another one of the summons, Leviathan, and what happened to them. But the pacing of the story, the way that they plug into the main game, they were sold obviously after the main game came out, but they're not really. And the first piece is end game content, you can argue. The second one makes a lot more sense if you play it as part of the overall run through and then hit the credits, just because of the way the second DLC ends. It ends with and the journey will go on kind of thing, which makes me think that they were in production during the game's production in itself, and would have made more sense just bolted onto the overall story rather than selling them piecemeal later on. And that's just kind of where it ended. Like, the various members of the dev team have been interviewed over the years saying they don't have anything else planned for 16, and it seems like it's wrapped up. Platform-wise, I want to talk about that idea that maybe putting it on Switch 2 would be the fire that they need.
Right.
Mainly just because there's a bit of, obviously, Final Fantasy history on Nintendo, the first 6 installments. You have that whole conversation on, like, Final Fantasy returning to Nintendo, and just the fact that so many people, I would probably buy 16 again if I on Switch 2.
Here's the thing. I don't want to, for the third video in a row, mildly criticize the Switch 2.
Please do.
Could it even run on the Switch 2?
Have you not seen Cyberpunk 2077?
Yeah, I have, and that's the issue. I was watching, funnily enough, Digital Foundry's review of that game yesterday, and the base version of Cyberpunk seems to run fine, but the next-gen exclusive Phantom Liberty runs arguably much, much worse than the base game. And, can you take something like Final Fantasy 16, which is a true next-gen exclusive, and port it to the Switch 2 if it's already heavily compromised, in performance mode at least, on the modern next-gen systems? Is there enough juice there, is what I'm trying to say.
This brings me back to the Square Enix side of things, where I don't think, or I'm hypothesizing that they don't believe in Final Fantasy as a brand as much as they did. I think that, obviously they're going to do the third installment for Final Fantasy VII, the remake trilogy, but the Battle Royale stuff was such a weird money grab, which has already been shut down. They had a Final Fantasy VII spin-off that was a Battle Royale, and they shut that down. 16, like I said, it felt like bits of that development were hampered, where pieces of it were then sold later as DLC. This Xbox release came 2 years later. So far, there's not mention of like a pocket edition to put it on mobile or put it on Switch or whatever. I just feel like they didn't give the team enough time. Like that whole thing of, is there enough juice there? Can you get enough out of the consoles to make it work? To me, that's always a question of optimization. Obviously, at some point, there's going to be something a console can't do, but I just don't feel like Square Enix are prioritizing this stuff. You saw them put more marketing into Foam Stars than the post-release of 16, and especially this Xbox version of 16. So, I don't know. I feel like it's in a weird place. Either Claire Obscure just hammered the nail into the coffin and it'll be done for a while, or it showed them how it could be done.
I don't think this is going to be the be-all or end-all, is what I would say and what I would finish on. I think these numbers are bad, no doubt. They are definitely not going to be what Square Enix wanted, but I do think 16 in particular is such a strange case. You do have all of the factors, like it was shadow dropped, it's controversial anyway, was there a hunger for it even on PlayStation 5, never mind going multi-platform. I think the proof will be in when we start seeing Intergrade come over and Rebirth come over, because there is a lot of potential in bringing older games to new consoles. We have seen this with the PlayStation getting stuff like Sea of Thieves and other Microsoft games where they rocket to the top of the sales list, but they have to be games that have that fan base to begin with, and maybe Final Fantasy 16 just will never have that.